In August 1942, Lieutenant Commander Marcus Thorne was the Navy's go-to man for debunking ghost stories and impossible mysteries. He dealt in facts, not fantasies. But when a massive military blimp drifted down from the sky with its engines still running, coffee still warm, and its two-man crew simply vanished into thin air, Thorne found himself face to face with a truth so terrifying that the very government he served would rather bury it than believe it. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. The world of Lieutenant Commander Marcus Thorne was a world of clean lines, hard data, and solvable puzzles. It was a world where chaos was simply a pattern not yet understood, where fear was the byproduct of ignorance. In August of 1942, with the larger world descending into the irrational madness of war, Thorne's private world, the Office of Naval Intelligence, was his fortress of reason. He stood before a projector screen in a stuffy wood-paneled office in San Francisco. On the screen, a jagged green line pulsed like a frantic heartbeat. This line, this waveform, was the source of tremendous fear for the two decorated captains sitting before him. They called it the ghost signal, a phantom voice that whispered static through the radio sets of destroyers and patrol boats across the Pacific, a chilling omen in the dead of night. They saw it as a new enemy weapon, or worse, something not of this world at all. Thorne saw it as noise. With a crisp snap, he brought a long wooden pointer to a specific spike on the waveform. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice calm, measured, and utterly devoid of the awe the subject seemed to demand. "The ghost you've been chasing is not Japanese. It is not German. And it is certainly not, as one of your frantic reports suggested, the sound of the sea speaking. It is in fact the predictable byproduct of our own progress." He gestured to a second chart, an overlay of the power grid from the new naval station at Treasure Island. "Your phantom is a simple harmonic resonance, a high-frequency oscillation from the station's primary generator bleeding into your comms array. It is an engineering problem, not an existential one. The solution is not an exorcism, but a $10 Faraday cage and better cable shielding." His explanation was brilliant. It was also deeply condescending, and he knew it. He watched the relief on the captains' faces mingle with the faint sting of embarrassment. They had allowed superstition to creep into the machine of war, and Thorne was the man they called to surgically remove it. He enjoyed his work. It was satisfying, like solving a crossword puzzle in a room full of people struggling with basic arithmetic. As they grumbled their thanks and departed, Thorne was already packing his briefcase, his mind moving on. The puzzle was solved. The box was closed. His assistant, a young ensign with perpetually wide eyes, approached him quietly and placed a file on his desk. It was thin, but the cover sheet was stamped with a thick red, "Urgent." "A call from Moffett Field, sir," the ensign said. "They have a situation. One of our airships." Thorne picked up the file. "Mechanical failure?" "That's just it, sir," the ensign replied, his voice dropping. "They don't know what it is." Thorne disliked the phrase, "don't know." It was an admission of intellectual surrender. There was always an answer. You just had to be smart enough and disciplined enough to find it. An hour later, Thorne's black sedan was a world away from the sterile order of naval intelligence. It was navigating the chaotic, sun-drenched streets of Daly City, a suburb of identical houses and manicured lawns, and crashed right in the middle of it was the situation. It was not a wreck. It was an arrival. The Navy blimp L-8, a 150-foot silver behemoth, was draped across the rooftops of two houses and the power lines connecting them. Its massive gas envelope was deflated, lying across the neat suburban landscape like a beached whale, impossible and silent. It was a profoundly surreal image, a violation of every known rule. Military police in white helmets struggled to maintain a perimeter against a growing crowd of gawking civilians. Reporters with bulky flashbulb cameras darted back and forth, hungry for a piece of the bizarre spectacle. Thorne stepped out of the car, his crisp, dark uniform a stark contrast to the pastel houses and the general mess. A young officer, Ensign Miller, rushed to meet him. Miller was barely 20, his face pale, and his eyes fixed on the downed airship, as if it might suddenly wake up. "Lieutenant Commander Thorne," Miller stammered, saluting. "Ensign Miller. I'm your assigned aide from Moffat." "Report, Ensign," Thorne said, his own eyes analytically scanning the scene, cataloguing details, ignoring the circus. It just came out of the sky, sir. About an hour ago. Drifted down as gentle as a feather. No explosion, no fire. The engines were still running when the ground crew got here. They had to shut them down." Thorne's gaze sharpened. "The crew?" Miller swallowed hard, his eyes darting back to the gondola hanging precariously between two roofs. "That's the problem, sir. There is no crew. They're gone." Thorne followed Miller's gaze to the small control car suspended beneath the massive fabric. Gone. The word hung in the air, simple and impossible. He walked past the police line, the gawking faces, the clicking cameras, his world of clean lines and hard data beginning to fray at the edges. The orderly, controlled environment of naval operations had physically crashed into the messy, unpredictable civilian world, presenting him with a problem that wasn't contained in a lab. It was bleeding all over the evening news. A makeshift ladder had been propped against the side of the gondola. Thorne pulled on a pair of thin white cotton gloves from his pocket, a ritual he performed before entering any scene. It was about preserving evidence, but it was also about creating a barrier between himself and the contamination of the unknown. He began to climb, the metal rungs cool under his gloved hands. The inside of the L-8's cockpit was even stranger than the outside. It was pristine, perfectly, eerily peaceful. Thorne stood in the cramped space and took it all in. 2 parachutes hung neatly on their hooks. A third, the life raft pack, was in its designated stowage, untouched. On the navigator's small table sat a metal thermos. Thorne unscrewed the cap and felt a wisp of steam. The coffee was still warm. Beside it lay a half-eaten sandwich on a wax paper wrapper. The controls were immaculate. Not a single switch was out of place. The radio was fully functional, set to the correct frequency. The ship's log was open to the previous day's entry, a pen resting beside it. A classified briefcase containing submarine detection codes was locked to the console, exactly as regulations required. There was no sign of struggle, no damage, no blood. There was nothing to suggest anything other than a perfectly normal, routine patrol. It was a machine in perfect working order, a scene of absolute normality, except for one glaring, impossible fact. The 2 men who were supposed to be flying it had vanished into thin air. Ensign Miller, who had followed him up the ladder, peered in nervously. "The papers, they're already calling it the Ghost Blimp," he whispered, as if afraid to say it too loud. Thorne let out a short, sharp scoff. It was a reflex, the sound of a rational mind dismissing a foolish romantic notion. "Don't be ridiculous, Ensign. Blimps are machines. Machines don't have ghosts." But as he spoke the words, his eyes scanned the cockpit one more time. He saw the untouched parachutes, the warm coffee, the silent radio. He saw the absolute, logical impossibility of it all. And for the first time that day, Marcus Thorne, the man who had an explanation for everything, felt a cold flicker of deep, profound unease. His scientific certainty was a shield, but for a brief moment he felt the sharp point of a question pressing against it. A question for which he had no immediate, comforting answer. Where did the men go? The cold flicker of unease that had sparked inside the gondola followed Thorne all the way to Moffett Field. The sprawling naval air station was the heart of America's lighter-than-air operations on the West Coast, a place of immense hangars and military precision. It was a place that should have felt like home to Thorne, a bastion of the order he so valued. But as he walked into the office of Captain Sterling, the Airfield S commanding officer, he felt the familiar chill of a different kind of irrationality: bureaucracy. Captain Sterling was a man whose uniform seemed to be made of concrete. His face was a political map of hardened lines and calculated severity. He waved Thorne into a chair without looking up from a file on his desk, Thorne's own preliminary report. "Lieutenant Commander," Sterling began, finally closing the file, "I've read your assessment. Pristine, no signs of struggle. Fully operational. It reads like a poem to a ghost." He leaned forward, his voice low and hard. "Let me be clear. There are no ghosts at Moffett Field. This is a military installation at war, not a dime store haunted house. We need an answer, Thorne. A simple, plausible answer, and we need it yesterday." Thorne met his gaze. "I deal in facts, Captain, not plausibility, and the facts are contradictory." "Then make them uncontradictory," Sterling snapped. "Two men were in that airship. Now they are not. They didn't sprout wings. The simplest explanation is that they fell out. An open hatch, a sudden lurch, pilot error. Tragic, but understandable. That is the story. Your job is to find the evidence that supports it." This was the dogma of the establishment, the corruption of the scientific process that Thorne despised. An answer decided before the investigation had even truly begun. "With respect, sir, the parachutes were still on board. The life raft was still on board. For two experienced pilots to fall out without a single sign of distress." "Experienced pilots make mistakes," Sterling cut him off, his voice rising. "And in wartime, we don't have the luxury of entertaining every far-fetched theory that pops into our heads. This incident is a match head in a warehouse full of gasoline. The press is having a field day. Congress will be asking questions. I need to give them an answer that puts the fire out, not one that fans the flames with talk of mysteries." He pushed a thin file across the desk. It was the L-8's flight plan. Thorne opened it to find entire sections blacked out with thick sensors ink. "This is heavily redacted, Captain. I'll need the full maintenance logs, the crew's service records." "Those documents are classified under wartime provisions," Sterling said flatly, his eyes like stone. "Find the answer in what you've been given, Commander. Conclude your investigation. Find the pilot error. File the report." It was an order. A wall of institutional power had just been erected in front of him. Thorne was no longer just fighting an impossible puzzle. He was now fighting the very system he served. The L-8's gondola, now stripped from its deflated envelope, sat under the harsh, sterile lights of Hangar 1. It looked small and lonely in the cavernous space. A metal coffin waiting for an undertaker. Thorne, having been dismissed by Sterling, poured his frustration into his work. This was his sanctuary. Here, there were no politics, no opinions, only data. He directed a small team with scientific detachment, his voice echoing in the massive hangar. "Inventory, every single item. I want a list, down to the last paperclip. Dust for prints on every surface. Check the engine cowlings for any sign of impact or repair." For hours, he worked. The results were maddening. The engines were perfect. The fuel tanks were nearly full, more than enough for their patrol. The radio, when powered, received a signal from the tower with perfect clarity. He interviewed the ground crew chief, a man with grease under his nails and 20 years of service in his eyes. "Lieutenant Cody and Ensign Adams," the chief said, shaking his head. "They were the best, by the book. Cody was the veteran, steady as a rock. Adams was the eager one, sharp as a tack. The idea of them doing something careless, it just doesn't fly, sir." Every new piece of data was another brick in the wall of impossibility. Every fact only amplified the mystery. Thorne stood before a large chalkboard listing the known variables. Perfect ship. Professional crew. Full fuel. No distress call. No parachutes used. He felt a vein throbbing in his temple. Logic demanded an answer. The universe could not simply contain a contradiction. He picked up the chalk, his mind clinging to the only path left. Sterling S path. Pilot error. But how? He began to construct a sequence, a desperate attempt to force the pieces to fit. Hypothesis 1, he wrote on the board. A minor, unlogged external issue. Perhaps a piece of rigging came loose, flapping against the envelope. A distraction, but not an emergency. No need for a radio call. Cody, the experienced one, decides to handle it himself. Adams assists. They don't wear their parachutes for a simple external check. They're bulky, unnecessary. They tether themselves to the gondola. They climb out. And then the tether fails. The wind, a sudden jolt. They fall. It was thin. It was a story built on a chain of unlikely maybes. But it was physical. It was mechanical. It was a sequence of events that obeyed the laws of physics. It didn't involve ghosts or phantom lights. It was a rational explanation. And right now, it was the only thing he had. He had his theory. Now he just needed to prove it. The Navy patrol boat slammed against the choppy waves of the Pacific, sending a cold spray across Thorne's face. He tasted salt and frustration. For hours, they had been tracing the L-8's known flight path, his eyes scanning the vast, empty expanse of grey water through powerful binoculars. He was searching for bodies, for debris, for a single shred of evidence to support his fragile hypothesis. The search was hopeless. The ocean was immense, and the currents were strong. Ensign Miller stood beside him, looking seasick and miserable. "Anything, sir?" "Nothing," Thorne said, lowering the binoculars. His own theory felt weaker and weaker with every passing wave. It was a story he told himself to keep the true madness of the situation at bay. The radio operator in the boat's small cabin suddenly called out, "Sir, we're getting a report from the Coast Guard. They've interviewed a civilian fishing boat." Thorne turned, a flicker of hope igniting within him. Did they see something? Debris? "No, sir," the operator said, his eyes wide. "They saw the blimp." "We know they saw the blimp," Thorne said impatiently. "When and where?" The operator checked his notes, his voice trembling slightly as he read. "The captain of the trawler Daisy E swears he saw it. This morning, he places it drifting aimlessly 20 miles inland, over the Salinas Valley." The words hit Thorne like a physical blow. Inland. He looked at his charts. The flight plan, even the redacted version, showed the L-8 was supposed to patrol exclusively over the ocean. If the crew had fallen into the water, the blimp, lightened of their weight, would have shot up to its pressure height and drifted with the prevailing westerly winds out to sea, not inland. Furthermore, the timing of the sighting was hours after they would have fallen. There was no way they fell into the ocean. Thorne lowered his binoculars, the heavy metal feeling cold and useless in his hands. The principle of falsifiability. A theory is only scientific if it can be proven false. It was his core tenet, his sharpest weapon, the very foundation of his rational world, and it had just turned on him, dismantling his only logical explanation with one simple, brutal fact. His hypothesis was not just wrong, it was impossible. He was back at square one, but it was worse now. He had been stripped of his only rational theory. He was adrift in a sea of inexplicable facts. He stared out at the grey, indifferent water, utterly and completely defeated. The ghost, it seemed, was winning. Defeat had a taste. It tasted like cheap whiskey in a smoky dive bar just off the main gate of Moffett Field. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, sweat, and desperation. For Lieutenant Commander Marcus Thorne, it was a foreign country. He was a man of clean lines and filtered air, but his world had collapsed into a sea of inexplicable facts, and so he had retreated here to a place where thinking was discouraged. He nursed his drink, trying to drown the image of the pristine gondola and the empty ocean. But the noise of the bar was a constant intrusion. At a nearby table, a group of sailors, loud and drunk, were telling war stories. And then he heard the phrase that made the whiskey burn in his throat. The Ghost Blimp. An old, grizzled chief petty officer with a face like a worn leather sea chart was holding court. "I'm telling you, it ain't natural," the old chief slurred, slamming his mug on the table. "Something snatched him. Same thing that's been out there for months." A younger sailor scoffed. "What thing, Chief? More of your sea monsters?" "Not monsters," the chief said, his voice dropping, his eyes suddenly clear and serious. "Lights, fast, silent. The flyboys are calling them foo fighters. Seen them myself on the midnight watch. They just hang there in the sky, watching. And I'll tell you something else. Lieutenant Cody, the pilot of that blimp, he saw him too. He was obsessed. Told anyone who'd listen that they were watching us, drawing pictures of them." Thorne listened, his scientific mind recoiling. It was exactly the kind of superstitious nonsense he'd built his career on dismantling. Drunken sailors spinning yarns about lights in the sky. It was absurd, and yet he couldn't tune it out. The old Chief's conviction was too raw, too unsettling. It wasn't the boastful tone of a storyteller. It was the quiet certainty of a witness. "He was a good man, Cody," the chief continued, his voice now low and somber. "But that thing got in his head. Wrote it all down. Not in the official logs, mind you. He was too smart for that. Kept his own book, a little private journal." Thorne froze, his glass halfway to his lips. A private journal, a non-official source, an unreliable, anecdotal piece of evidence he would normally dismiss without a second thought. But his official sources were exhausted. His reliable methods had failed. Out of sheer bottomless desperation, Thorne was left with only one path forward: to chase a ghost story from a drunk in a bar. He quietly finished his whiskey, slid a few bills onto the bar, and walked out into the cold night air, his principles feeling as cheap as the liquor he'd just swallowed. The base was quiet, the rows of pilots' barracks standing like silent, identical tombs under the faint moonlight. Thorne, a man who lived by rules and regulations, moved like a shadow. This was a clear violation, a betrayal of his own rigid code. In his hand, he held a small set of metal tools, a set of lockpicks he'd confiscated from a captured spy years ago and kept as a souvenir of a solved puzzle. Now, he was using them to commit a crime. He found Lieutenant Cody S. footlocker at the end of a deserted bunkhouse. The lock was standard military issue. With a Surgeon S focus, Thorne inserted the pick and the tension wrench. He worked with a tense, unfamiliar urgency. The sound of the tumblers clicking one by one was deafening in the silence. Finally, a soft thunk. The lock sprang open. He lifted the lid. The locker smelled of soap and old leather, neatly folded uniforms, a photograph of a smiling woman, a few paperback novels. It was the unremarkable history of an ordinary man. Thorne's hope began to fade. Maybe the old chief was just drunk after all. He dug deeper, his fingers brushing against the cold metal bottom of the trunk, and then he felt it. Tucked beneath the floorboard lining, a small leather-bound notebook. He pulled it out and opened it under the beam of his small flashlight. It was filled with Cody's precise, technical handwriting. At first glance, the pages looked like standard astronomical charts, full of celestial positions and navigational notes. But then Thorne saw them. Marked in red ink were objects that didn't belong, objects that moved against the rotation of the stars. They were not planes, not comets, not anything he could identify. They were strange, geometric shapes, tracked with meticulous care across the empty Pacific. Dates, times, and atmospheric conditions were all recorded with scientific precision. The old sailor's superstitious tale about lights in the sky was right here, corroborated by cold, hard, empirical data. Thorne stared at the journal, a chill running through him that had nothing to do with the night air. He had come here chasing a ghost story. He had found a logbook. Back in the soulless quiet of his temporary office, Thorne worked with a feverish intensity he hadn't felt in years. The bottle of whiskey was forgotten. This was his element. He was surrounded by maps, reference books, and the cryptic pages of Cody's journal. The star charts, when cross-referenced with official naval grid maps of the Pacific, revealed a terrifying secret. Cody hadn't just been stargazing. He had been tracking a silent, unknown object on a deliberate, intelligent course through the primary patrol sectors off the California coast. Thorne's hands moved over the papers, his mind racing, connecting the dots. He was no longer a debunker of myths. He was a decoder of a dead man's obsession. He finally reached the last entry. It was dated the morning of the final flight. His blood ran cold as he read the neat, steady handwriting. August 16th, 1942. Azo 600 hours. It is back. Same position as last week. It isn't sending signals. It's a presence. It is watching. All this time, we've been the ones looking through the glass, but it's been looking back. Adams thinks I'm a fool. Thinks the strain is getting to me. Maybe he's right. But today, we get proof. We are going to get a closer look. A horrifying realization dawned on Thorne's face. A cold, clinical certainty that was far more terrifying than any ghost story. The entire foundation of his investigation crumbled. He had been asking the wrong questions. He'd been searching for a cause, an accident, a malfunction. He had been looking for what had happened to the crew. But that wasn't it at all. They hadn't fallen. They hadn't been taken. The pristine cockpit, the untouched parachutes, the warm coffee. It all made a new, terrible kind of sense. It was the image of a departure, a deliberate one. They had opened the door of the gondola, thousands of feet above the Pacific, and left their perfectly good airship mid-flight. They had gone willingly to get a closer look at something waiting for them in the sky. The horrifying truth of Cody's journal was a weight in Thorne's hand and a fire in his mind. He had the answer, an answer so monstrous, so far outside the realm of conventional warfare and human experience that it had to be brought into the light. He strode into Captain Sterling's office the next morning, not as a subordinate, but as a messenger bearing a terrible revelation. He laid the open journal on Sterling's polished desk. "Captain," Thorne began, his voice tight with urgency, "I have to retract my previous hypothesis. They didn't fall. They weren't pushed. They left." Sterling looked from Thorne's intense, almost manic face down to the journal. He picked it up, his expression a mask of deep skepticism. He read through the pages, his brow furrowing deeper with every cryptic chart and entry. When he reached the final, chilling sentence, he didn't look horrified. He looked furious. "What is this, Commander?" Sterling's voice was a low growl. "A dead man's diary? You're basing an official investigation on a fantasy novel written by a man who was clearly unstable." "It's not fantasy, it's data," Thorne countered, pointing to the charts. "Meticulously recorded data. It tracks an object, Captain, an unknown object. Cody and Adams went to investigate it." Sterling slammed the journal shut. The sound echoed in the quiet office like a gunshot. "They went to investigate a presence," he spat, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. "And you believe this? You, the man they send to stamp out rumors, are bringing me ghost stories. Do you have any idea what would happen if a story like this got out? Mass panic, hysteria. We are at war, Thorne, and the home front is a tinderbox. This delusion would be the match." He saw it then. Sterling wasn't a man of science or a seeker of truth. He was a gatekeeper of reality, and Thorne's discovery was a reality he refused to allow. "I think the strain has gotten to you, Commander," Sterling said, his voice now cold and clinical. "You couldn't find a simple answer, so your mind invented a complex one. You've cracked." He took the journal and locked it in his desk drawer. "As of this moment, this investigation is officially closed. The finding is pilot error. The crew was lost at sea. You will be reassigned, effective immediately. You are to leave this base within the hour." Thorne stood, stunned into silence. "And let me be perfectly clear," Sterling added, his eyes narrowing to slits. "If one word of this theory ever leaves this room, I will see you court-martialed for spreading seditious rumors in wartime. You will spend the rest of this war in a military prison. Do you understand me?" Thorne had been stripped of his authority, his evidence, and his purpose. His pursuit of the empirical truth had just become a heretical act. He was a man without a mission, cast out from the world of order and authority he once commanded. But Sterling's threats had only solidified his resolve. The truth couldn't be buried in a desk drawer. There was one more thread to pull, a thread that existed outside of official reports and military regulations. He found Ensign Adams' fiancée, a young woman named Sarah, in a quiet diner in San Jose. Her eyes were red-rimmed and hollow with grief. Thorne sat opposite her in the booth, the smell of coffee and fried onions feeling obscene in the face of her loss. He explained who he was, gently, telling her he was trying to understand what happened. "They said it was an accident," she said, her voice barely a whisper, twisting a paper napkin in her hands. "That Jimmy, that he was careless." "I don't believe he was," Thorne said quietly. "I knew his partner, Lieutenant Cody, was interested in unusual phenomena. I was worried Ensign Adams was pressured into something." Sarah shook her head, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. "Jimmy was terrified of Mr. Cody's obsession. He thought he was going crazy, talking about lights, about being watched. He told Jimmy he was going to prove it, with or without him." She looked up, her eyes meeting Thorne's, and he saw a flicker of the same fear he'd seen in the eyes of the sailors in the bar. But it wasn't just Mr. Cody. The day before the flight, Jimmy saw it too. Thorne leaned forward, his heart pounding. "He saw the lights?" "He didn't know what he saw," she said, her voice cracking. "He came home late. He was pale. He just kept saying, 'It wasn't ours, Sarah. It was a machine, but it wasn't ours.' He was so scared. He only went on that flight the next day to try and stop Mr. Cody from doing something stupid and reckless. He went up there to save his friend." Thorne sat back, the weight of her words settling upon him. This wasn't a logbook. This was human testimony. It was emotional, anecdotal, a form of data he would have scorned just a week ago. But hearing it from her, seeing the raw, honest pain in her eyes, it became the most powerful piece of evidence he had. It was the corroboration he needed. The story wasn't just real. It was a tragedy. Night fell on Moffett Field. Thorne, now an outcast, sat in his car on a dark service road, staring at the colossal silhouette of Hangar 1 against the starry sky. He was beaten, but not broken. There was one last chance, one final desperate gamble for the kind of proof that men like Sterling couldn't bury: a photograph. In his meticulous review of the L-8's logs, before Sterling had cut him off, he'd noted a small, overlooked detail. The blimp had been fitted with a high-altitude meteorological camera on its exterior hull, a device for taking pictures of cloud formations. Sterling's team, focused entirely on the pristine interior of the gondola, had missed it completely. Driven by a final, desperate need for physical proof, he snuck back onto the base, a ghost in the machine he once commanded. He found the L-8's carcass resting on a massive scaffold inside the hangar. Using a maintenance ladder, he climbed onto the cold, smooth skin of the deflated blimp. He moved carefully across the vast expanse of silver fabric, his footsteps silent in the cavernous space. He found the camera mount, a small metal housing near the tail. His fingers, numb with cold and adrenaline, fumbled with the latch. It sprang open. Inside, untouched, was a small metal canister of film. He had it. He had the proof. A wave of triumph washed over him. And then the world exploded in white light. A spotlight from the hangar's catwalk pinned him against the side of the blimp. "Don't move!" a voice boomed through the hangar. He was blinded, exposed. Military police swarmed the base of the scaffold, their rifles raised. From the darkness of the catwalk, a figure emerged, walking slowly into the beam of the spotlight. Thorne didn't need to see his face to know who it was. Captain Sterling stood there, looking down at him not with surprise, but with the cold, grim fury of a man whose orders had been defied. Thorne was caught. The confrontation under the hangar spotlight did not end with Thorne in handcuffs. It ended with a tense, bitter negotiation in Sterling's office. Thorne, holding the unopened film canister like a poker chip, had called in his last and most valuable favor, a direct line to an admiral in Washington. A man whose career Thorne had once saved with his unerring logic. Faced with the choice between a quiet resolution and a very loud inquiry from on high, Sterling had relented. Thorne was allowed to develop the film on one condition. Afterward, the matter was finished, buried, and he was to disappear from Moffett Field forever. And so, Thorne found himself in a place he hadn't been since his academy days, a small, dark photo lab deep in the bowels of the Naval Intelligence building. The only light was the dim, safe, red glow. The only sound was the gentle sloshing of chemicals in their trays. With him was a man named Peterson, a quiet, older lab technician with steady hands, the recipient of Thorne's last favor. "It's a long shot, Pete," Thorne said, his voice tense in the small space. It was a weather camera, bouncing around on the hull. "You don't risk a court-martial for a long shot, Marcus," Peterson replied, his eyes focused on the negatives he was carefully washing. "Let's see what you caught." Peterson hung the dripping strip of negatives to dry. Thorne leaned in, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He scanned the tiny squares. The first images were exactly what he expected. Endless, overexposed shots of clouds and the glint of the sun on the ocean. Frame after frame of nothing. Sterling was right. It was a fool's errand. Thorne's shoulders slumped, the last of his hope draining away. "Wait," Peterson whispered, his voice suddenly tight. "Look here. The last sequence." Thorne followed his gaze. The final few frames were different. They were blurry, distorted by atmospheric heat and the vibration of the airship. But they showed something. It was a vast, dark shape, hanging silently in the clouds. It was non-reflective, a patch of absolute black against the bright sky. It was not an aircraft. It was not a balloon. It was a perfect geometric impossibility, a shape that had no business existing in nature. "My God," Peterson breathed, his scientific detachment evaporating. "What is that?" Thorne couldn't answer. He could only stare, his mind struggling to process the image. Then, Peterson pointed a trembling finger to the final, terrifying frame on the strip. "There," he said. "Look at the bottom." Thorne leaned closer, his eyes straining. In the bottom corner of the photo, tiny and indistinct, but undeniably present, were two human figures. They were on ropes, descending from the L-8's gondola. But they weren't descending. The angle was wrong. They were moving away from the blimp, ascending on their lines towards the immense dark object. They had gone to it, willingly. The photograph was the final, irrefutable proof. It was a fact without a theory, a picture of an event that science had no words for. Dawn broke over San Francisco, casting long grey shadows into Thorne's temporary office. He hadn't slept. He sat at his desk, the damning photographs spread out before him like a tarot reading from a madman. The geometric shape, the ascending figures. Proof. In front of him lay two documents. One was the official report form, pre-signed by Captain Sterling, its conclusion already written. Lost at sea. The other was a blank investigation summary. Thorne rolled a fresh sheet of paper into his typewriter. He began to type, the rhythmic clacking of the keys the only sound in the room. His fingers moved with a slow, deliberate finality. "After reviewing all available evidence," he typed, "and conducting a thorough search of the designated patrol area, the conclusive cause of the incident cannot be determined," he continued, writing a masterpiece of bureaucratic ambiguity, a report that said everything and nothing. No verifiable trace of the crew, Lieutenant E.D. Cody and Ensign C. Adams, has been found. Evidence of catastrophic equipment failure is inconclusive. He pulled the sheet from the typewriter. He took the official Lost at Sea report from Sterling and, with a steady hand, signed his own name at the bottom. The lie was now official. Then he took the photographs, the impossible, reality-bending photographs, and his own handwritten notes, detailing the truth of Cody's journal. And he sealed them all in a plain, manila envelope. He had followed science to its absolute limit and found himself standing on the edge of a cliff. He made the choice. He chose to suppress the proof, to report only the evidence. He chose to protect the world of clean lines and simple answers from a truth it was not ready for. The sun was bright as Thorne walked across the tarmac of Moffett Field for the last time. He approached Captain Sterling and formally handed him the signed official report. Sterling took it, his eyes scanning the signature. He gave a curt, relieved nod. No words were exchanged about the real truth. It was a silent, mutual agreement to bury the impossible. As Thorne walked toward his car, he saw Ensign Miller standing near the gate, watching him. Miller, the young, nervous officer who had been there from the beginning, who had whispered the words "Ghost Blimp" with fear and awe. Thorne changed his course slightly. He drew alongside the young man and paused. Discreetly, he passed the sealed manila envelope to the ensign. Miller took it, his eyes wide with confusion. "What's this, sir?" "For the real archives, Ensign," Thorne said quietly, his voice low and serious. "Not for the captain's file, the one nobody ever looks at. Some truths aren't meant for the light of day. Not yet." Miller looked from the envelope to Thorne's face, and, in a moment of understanding that was far beyond his years, he nodded. He clutched the package to his chest, understanding the gravity of the secret he now held. Thorne got into his car and started the engine. He didn't look back. As he drove away from the base, he was a man fundamentally changed. The arrogant debunker who arrived a week ago was gone, replaced by a humbled guardian of an impossible secret. He turned on the car radio, and a newsman was talking about strange sightings off the coast. A week ago, Thorne would have scoffed and changed the station. Now he just listened, his face a mixture of awe and fear, his eyes on the vast, mysterious sky. He didn't have the answers anymore, and for the first time in his life he understood that maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of true wisdom. What's more satisfying than a solved mystery? We read drawn to stories that provide answers, that impose order on chaos. But the story of the L-8 Ghost Blimp leaves us with something far more unsettling. We follow Lieutenant Commander Thorne, a man whose entire world is built on verifiable facts and logical deduction. He's the person you call to kill a ghost story with a clean, scientific explanation. Yet, as he peels back the layers of this mystery, every fact he uncovers pushes him further away from a rational answer and closer to something that feels like folklore. The most fascinating part of his journey isn't the discovery of what happened, but his decision about what to do with that knowledge. He finds his proof a blurry photograph of an event that defies explanation. But it's not the kind of proof that fits neatly into an official report. It is a fact without a theory, a truth so profound it is indistinguishable from madness. So, Thorne, the ultimate rationalist, makes an irrational choice. He signs his name to the convenient lie and buries the terrifying truth in a secret archive. He chooses to protect the system from a fact it cannot compute. It leaves you wondering about the nature of truth itself. If a fact is so unbelievable that it serves no purpose but to create fear and chaos, is it still worth revealing?